I wasn't looking for this. I was researching classical sculpture techniques, the standard academic fare, marble carving, chisel marks, the slow, patient work of Renaissance masters. But then I found a photograph from the Marble Palace in St. Petersburg. A stone veil, not carved to look like fabric, but draped like fabric, folded, creased, with a thinness that made it translucent when backlit. And I stopped. Because you can't carve marble that thin. You can't chisel stone into sheets so delicate they ripple like silk. The material would fracture, crumble, disintegrate under the slightest pressure. Yet there it was, not just in St. Petersburg, but in Naples, in Vienna, in Istanbul, in churches and palaces across continents that supposedly had no contact with one another. The official explanation? Masterful artistry, painstaking technique, generations of craftsmen perfecting their skills. But the official explanation collapses the moment you examine the physics. Let me show you what I mean. The Veiled Christ in Naples, created, we're told, in 1753 by Giuseppe San Martino. A full-body sculpture of Christ beneath a shroud so thin you can see the contours of his face through the stone. The veil appears wet, clinging to flesh, translucent in places. Marble, they say, carved from a single block. Except marble doesn't behave that way. It fractures along grain lines. It chips when worked too thin. The thinnest sections of that veil are perhaps 2 millimeters thick, thinner than most smartphone screens. How do you carve something that delicate without modern tools? Without diamond bits, without precision measuring equipment, without computer-aided design? You ask the experts and they speak in generalities. Exceptional skill, patience, years of practice. But they never explain the actual process. They never demonstrate it. They never show you the intermediate steps, the failed attempts, the learning curve that should exist, because when you search for those records, they aren't there. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. The veiled Vestal Virgin in Rome, the veiled Rebecca in Milan, the bust of Modesty in Naples, the veiled Truth statue in Vienna. All created within the same narrow window of time, 1717 to 1768, all exhibiting the same impossible thinness, all draped, folded, gathered as if the stone had been soft when shaped. And here's what makes it stranger. Many of these works were attributed to the Corradini family or their immediate circle. Antonio Corradini created several. His student Giuseppe San Martino created others. The technique appeared suddenly, flourished for 50 years, then vanished almost completely. No gradual development, no crude early attempts, no learning period where the veils were thicker, less refined, more obviously carved. The earliest examples are as sophisticated as the latest ones, as if the technique arrived fully formed, was practiced for a brief window, then disappeared. Ask yourself, why? Why would such a revolutionary sculpting method, one that produced works so breathtaking they still draw crowds centuries later, simply stop being used? Why wouldn't every sculptor in Europe learn it? Why wouldn't it spread, evolve, become standard practice, unless it wasn't a carving technique at all? The deeper I looked, the more I found references to something else entirely, something the official histories mention briefly, then dismiss. Stone softening. Alchemical texts from the medieval period describe processes for mollifying stone, making it pliable, workable, temporary soft. These weren't poetic metaphors, they were recipes, instructions, formulas involving specific plants, acids, mineral compounds. The Incas were said to possess such knowledge, the Egyptians, the builders of Gothic cathedrals. But when you search for documentation, for chemical analysis, for serious scholarly investigation of these claims, you find silence. Not debunking, not thorough refutation, just silence. As if the question itself is inappropriate to ask. I found a 19th century account from a Colonel Percy Fawcett, describing how he witnessed indigenous peoples in South America using a plant extract to soften stone, allowing them to mould it by hand before it rehardened. He took samples. He promised further investigation. He disappeared in the Amazon in 1925. The samples, if they ever existed, were never catalogued. I found references to a vitriol-based process in Jesuit records from the 1600s described as a method for rendering stone briefly plastic. The records were fragmentary, incomplete, as if pages had been removed. I found patents from the early 1900s, briefly filed, never pursued, describing chemical compounds that could temporarily alter crystalline matrices in calcium-based stone. Filed, noted, then forgotten. The evidence suggests something much larger. Let me take you somewhere specific. The Palacio de Comunicaciones in Madrid, completed in 1919. Look at the stone facades. The decorative elements aren't merely carved, they're moulded. Organic curves that flow like fabric frozen mid-motion. Impossible undercuts that would require removing surrounding stone that isn't missing. Continuous patterns that wrap around corners without seams. The official record says these were carved by hand. But examine the repetition. Identical flourishes appear in dozens of locations, not similar, identical, down to the millimetre, as if cast from the same mould, or pressed from stone rendered temporarily soft. The Woolworth Building in New York, 1913. Terracotta ornamentation so intricate, so delicate, it shouldn't survive a single winter freeze-thaw cycle. Yet it has for over a century without cracking or deteriorating. Why? Because terracotta, fired clay, is more resilient than marble. Or because something about how it was formed made it fundamentally different from modern terracotta. The pattern repeats. Chicago, Philadelphia, Budapest, Prague. Buildings from the same narrow period, 1880 to 1920, exhibiting the same sophisticated stone manipulation, the same impossible thinness, the same organic flowing forms, and then it stops. This is where Tartaria enters the conversation, not as a definitive empire with clear borders and documented rulers, but as a placeholder, a name for whatever civilization or knowledge system existed before the current historical narrative was written. Because something was here, something possessed knowledge we've lost. The maps help clarify this. 18th and 19th century cartography consistently labels vast regions of northern Asia as Tartary or Tartaria. These aren't speculative maps, they're official documents, French, British, German, Russian, all agreeing on the nomenclature. Then, after 1850, the name disappears, replaced with Russia, Mongolia, China, as if nothing had changed except the labels. But when you examine the architectural record, when you look at the buildings constructed during that transitional period, you find something strange. Structures attributed to local builders or Russian engineers that exhibit advanced techniques, sophisticated mathematics, and stoneworking methods that shouldn't exist according to the available technology. The Kazan Cathedral in St. Petersburg, completed in 1811, built, we're told, by Russian architect Andrei Voronikin using local craftsmen. Yet the colonnade features 96 identical Corinthian columns, each carved from a single piece of granite, each exhibiting identical proportions, identical fluting, identical capitals. How? How do you achieve that uniformity? How do you transport 96 monolithic granite columns, each weighing multiple tons, position them perfectly and carve them identically without industrial machinery? The official answer, patience and skill. But patience doesn't explain precision, and skill doesn't explain coordination at this scale. Let me show you the coordination problem. The technique of stone veiling appears simultaneously in Italy, Austria, Russia, and France. Not sequentially, not spreading gradually from a single origin point, simultaneously. Between 1717 and 1768, master sculptors across Europe suddenly produce works of identical sophistication, using what appears to be the same method. How? No trade guilds documented sharing the technique, no apprentices travelling between cities to spread the knowledge, no published treatises explaining the process, just simultaneous mastery, as if everyone received the same instructions at the same time. Now expand that pattern. The neoclassical architectural movement of the late 1700s and early 1800s sees virtually identical government buildings, museums, banks and opera houses appear in cities across Europe and America. Same proportions, same dome structures, same column arrangements, same mathematical harmonics in their design. We're told this is simply architectural fashion, everyone copying Greek and Roman styles. But they're not copying Rome. The proportions are different, the mathematics are more sophisticated, the load-bearing techniques are more advanced. These buildings claim to be inspired by classical architecture, but they exceed their supposed models in every measurable way, as if they were following instructions they didn't fully understand, instructions inherited from something older. Here's the strangest part. When you examine stone softening claims from around the world, you find consistency, not in the methods. Different cultures describe different processes, but in the evidence. The archaeological signatures, Sacsayhuaman in Peru, massive polygonal stones fitted together with precision measured in fractions of millimeters. No mortar, no gaps, stones weighing up to 200 tons, shaped with curves and angles that interlock like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. The official explanation: they used harder stones to pound softer stones into shape. Except when you examine the stones, you find no percussion marks, no evidence of hammering or grinding. The surfaces are smooth, as if moulded. And the tight fits, tolerances so precise you can't insert a piece of paper between blocks, suggest the stones were shaped while pressed together, conforming to one another. The Assyrian in Egypt, massive red granite blocks, some weighing over 100 tons, arranged in precise alignments, cut with such accuracy that modern stonemasons struggle to explain the process. No tool marks, no evidence of the copper chisels and dolerite pounders Egyptologists claim were used. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. T-shaped limestone pillars, some reaching 18 feet tall and weighing 10 tons, carved with intricate reliefs of animals. Dated to 9600 BCE, before agriculture, before cities, before metal tools. How? The official timeline suggests hunter-gatherers somehow quarried, carved, transported and erected these megaliths using stone tools and rope. But when you look closely, you see the same signature. Smooth surfaces, precise angles, organic curves that suggest plasticity rather than percussion. Let me take you back to the veils. I started examining them under different lighting conditions. What I found changed everything. The veiled Christ in Naples, when photographed with raking light at specific angles, you can see something beneath the veil. Not carved detail, not tooling marks, but compression lines, as if the fabric had been pressed into the stone while both were soft, leaving an impression that hardened into permanence. The folds aren't carved to represent fabric. They are fabric, fossilized in calcium. This raises a simple but critical question. What if the veils aren't stone carved to look like cloth, but cloth petrified into stone? Not through slow mineralization, that takes millennia and produces different textures, but through controlled chemical alteration, a process that could render stone temporarily soft, allowing fabric to be pressed into it, then reverting to stone once the process completed. That would explain the translucence, the thinness, the perfect draping, the impossible delicacy. It would also explain why the technique disappeared. Because it wasn't a carving technique, it was a chemical process. And chemistry can be lost, formulas can be destroyed, knowledge can be suppressed. The timeline is critical. Stone softening references appear consistently in alchemical and natural philosophy texts through the 1700s. Then, during the early 1800s, the exact period when centralized educational systems were being established, when scientific academies were standardizing knowledge, when historical narratives were being codified, these references begin disappearing. Not refuted, not disproven, simply removed. Academic curricula that once included alchemical studies shifted entirely to modern chemistry. Libraries were reorganized, their collections updated. Universities purged their holdings of pre-scientific texts as superstitious or outdated. By 1850, the idea of stone softening had been relegated to folklore, treated as primitive misunderstanding rather than documented practice. But the buildings remained, the sculptures remained, the physical evidence of techniques we're told never existed, and that's where the silence becomes deafening. Modern stonemasons don't know how the veils were made. They can approximate the effect with modern tools, diamond bits, precision grinders, computer-aided carving, but the results are thicker, less refined, obviously mechanical. The originals remain superior to anything we can produce today with vastly better technology. How is that possible? How do 18th century sculptors using hand tools exceed the capabilities of 21st century artisans using power equipment? Unless they had something we don't, not better tools, different knowledge. I started looking for the missing records, the gaps in documentation, the places where history should speak but remain silent. The Great Fire of 1812 in Moscow destroyed 3/4 of the city. Records burned, libraries lost, architectural documentation vanished. What survived? The buildings themselves, structures that required advanced stoneworking, sophisticated engineering, mathematical precision beyond what the available tools should allow. The Chicago Fire of 1871. Similar story, widespread destruction, records lost. But certain buildings survived, the ones built with pre-fire techniques that subsequent construction couldn't replicate. The San Francisco earthquake of 1906. Records destroyed, city archives burned, yet photographs from before the disaster show buildings exhibiting that same sophisticated stonework, those same organic forms, that same impossible precision. The pattern repeats, cities burn, records vanish, but the buildings, the physical evidence, remain. And when they're demolished quietly, without documentation, without preserving samples, without architectural analysis, almost as if someone wanted to erase the evidence. Let me show you what they're demolishing. The Singer Building in New York, completed in 1908, demolished in 1968. At the time, the tallest building ever voluntarily demolished. Why? Official reason: outdated, inefficient, not profitable. But examine photographs of its stonework, intricate terracotta facades, impossibly delicate ornamentation, organic flowing designs that modern architects admit they couldn't reproduce. The original Pennsylvania Station in New York, completed in 1910, demolished in 1963. One of the most beautiful examples of Beaux-Arts architecture in America. Massive granite columns, soaring travertine walls, vaulted ceilings that required engineering techniques we still don't fully understand. Demolished for progress. The Larkin Administration Building in Buffalo, completed in 1906, demolished in 1950. Frank Lloyd Wright called it one of his greatest works. It featured air conditioning, built-in furniture, and structural innovations decades ahead of their time. Gone. Hundreds of buildings from that same narrow period, 1880 to 1920, demolished throughout the 20th century. Not because they were unsound, not because they were dangerous, but because they were obsolete. Obsolete, that word keeps appearing, as if buildings exhibiting superior craftsmanship, more sophisticated engineering, and greater durability than modern construction are somehow less advanced. Unless obsolete means something else, unless it means evidence of something we're supposed to have forgotten. When you assemble all the evidence, when you see the full scope of what's been lost, the conclusion becomes unavoidable. There was a technology, a process for manipulating stone, for rendering it temporarily plastic, for shaping it in ways our current methods cannot replicate. This technology was widespread, global even, practiced across cultures that had no documented contact. And then within a single generation, it disappeared. Not gradually, not through natural technological evolution where old methods are slowly replaced by better ones, but abruptly, completely, with no transitional period, no debate, no published explanation. The last documented stone veils were created around 1768. By 1800, no one was making them. By 1850, the technique was considered lost. By 1900, historians were treating it as impossible, attributing the surviving examples to exceptional carving skill, rather than acknowledging what the evidence clearly shows. Why? Why would we lose a technology that produced superior results? Why would knowledge that took generations to develop simply vanish without trace? Why would the entire global community of stonemasons, sculptors, architects and builders simultaneously forget how to do something they'd been doing for centuries? Unless they didn't forget, unless they were told to stop, unless the knowledge was deliberately suppressed. I want you to look at one final image. The Veiled Truth from Vienna, created by Antonio Corradini around 1750. A female figure, entirely shrouded, the stone veil so thin it's translucent in places. You can see the suggestion of features beneath, a face, shoulders, the curve of a body, rendered in stone so delicate it seems impossible. Now ask yourself, what secret was worth erasing this knowledge? What truth did they veil, not in stone, but in silence? Because the buildings remain, the sculptures remain. The physical evidence of techniques we've been told never existed surrounds us, if we're willing to see it. These aren't primitive attempts at artistry. They're remnants of a sophisticated civilization, a global knowledge system, a technological understanding that exceeded our own. We didn't invent progress, we inherited ruins, and then we forgot how to read them. The question isn't whether stone softening technology existed. The evidence answers that. The question is, why were we taught it didn't? What else have we been told never happened? What other knowledge was erased, buried, paved over in the rush toward modernity? And most unsettling, who decided what we were allowed to remember? I can't answer those questions, not definitively, but I can show you the evidence. I can point to the gaps, the silences, the impossible artifacts we're told to ignore. The rest, the conclusions you draw, the questions you ask, those are yours. Just remember, once you see the veils, you can't unsee them. Once you recognize the pattern, you'll find it everywhere, in every city, every museum, every history book that explains without explaining. The cloth of stone remains, delicate, translucent, impossible. A technology we've been told never existed. But look closely at the folds, at the way light passes through them, at the precision no chisel could achieve. And ask yourself, what else are they hiding in plain sight?